Hi there. Thank you for joining me on this second part of the videos on lymphatic system. On this video, we will be discussing lymphoid tissues. We will be first talking about lymph nodes and then lymphatic organs. You might remember that we finished our last video by talking about lymphoid cells. Now we are moving to a little larger scale, and we will start by looking at lymphoid tissues. And as usual, I want to start by considering the main functions of lymphoid tissues. So these tissues provide sites where the lymphocytes are housed, as well as a site where they can proliferate should there be a need for more of these. Another function would be lymphoid tissues providing a surveillance site where lymphocytes and macrophages can filter through the lymph. So those are our two main functions. And in case you were wondering about the tissue types, well, which we saw in our earlier studies, and I will include a link to the end of this video if you have forgotten these main tissue types. Well, lymphoid tissues are largely composed of reticular connective tissue. This is a type of loose connective tissue. Check out the link in the end if you have forgotten these tissue types. And macrophages live on the reticular fibers, while lymphocytes occupy the spaces between the fibers when they return to lymphoid tissues after patrolling the body. There are two main types of lymphoid tissues. General tissue, which is found almost everywhere in the body, and specialized tissue, which gives rise to the lymph nodes and lymphatic organs. Let's start by looking at the lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are glands of an immune system. They typically enlarge in response to a bacterial or viral infection. They contain high concentration of lymphocytes and macrophages, so their function is to fight pathogens. And there are hundreds of nodes that are found throughout the body. They are often found as groups or chains by the large lymphatic vessels. And if we wish to define their function a bit more, we can find a twofold function. To filter the lymph so that we can clean it, this would be removing potentially harmful pathogens from the lymph. And second function would be related to the immune system by activating it. This is where macrophages and lymphocytes play a key role. So where in the body do we find lymph nodes? Let's talk a little bit more about that. Well, as I said, lymph nodes are found often as clusters, and therefore they are named on many occasions based on their location. Let's have a look at some of these. First, cervical region of lymph nodes. Well, this would be at the neck. And this is a very common site to test if your lymph nodes are swollen. You might recall this from your doctor's visits, for example. Then, axillary, of course, refers to our armpit. As I'm sure that you remember, there are a lot of lymph nodes there. And these are easily accessible to feel there too. Then we have supratrochlear lymph nodes above the trochlear notch. So at the cubital fossa, the opposite side of an elbow. Inguinal lymph nodes are located at the groin area, another region where it is easy to feel these lymph nodes. We tend to use this less in a clinical practice for obvious reasons. Abdominal is probably quite self-explanatory, I guess. So at the abdominal region. And finally, thoracic lymph nodes at the thorax. So that is some lymph node regions that might be good to know as they are commonly used. And just as a curiosity, because I think that this was interesting, of course, animals have lymph nodes too. Here we see easily palpable regions of lymph nodes in cat. You can bet that I have been testing these on my cat after I learned about this, and I can confirm, yes, they are there. Okay, now let's have a look at the lymph nodes in a little greater detail. So these are small and round blobs, if you wish to describe them this way. Many say that their shape looks a little bit like beans. They are small, as I said, less than 2.5 centimeters in size. For those of you who are not totally familiar with the metric scale, this would be about 1 inch. So that size or smaller. Another thing to notice is that there is a capsule around a lymph node. This is fibrous, and fibers from the capsule extend inwards as a structure called trabeculæ or trabeculæ. These divide the lymph node into separate compartments. And finally, I want to highlight that we have two histologically distinct regions in a node. A more external cortex and more internal medulla. And now we will discuss these two regions in a little bit more detail. But before we do that, I want to show a really nice histological view of a section of a lymph node. Notice that we have used different stains to highlight different regions, and then we have taken a photomicrograph of it for you. This is some really nice sample preparation work that we see here. So, what we need to know about the cortex of a lymph node? Well, as I said earlier, these are superficial areas of a node, and they contain follicles with germinal centers, which are heavy with dividing B cells. Deep cortex then again houses T cells in transit. Think about it. T cells circulate continuously among blood and lymph nodes and lymph. Another thing that we see in the cortex is that there are abundant number of dendritic cells, which are closely associated with T and B cells. They play a role in activating both lymphocytes. So that's our cortex. Let's have a look at the medulla. In medulla, medullary cords, which originated from the cortex, they extend inwards. They contain B cells, T cells, and plasma cells. Finally, I will mention that we do also find lymph sinuses throughout the node. Remember, the term sinus refers to an opening in an anatomical language. And these lymph sinuses are openings where macrophages live to screen the lymph. Before we leave the topic of a lymph node, I want us to have a closer look at this figure. It shows a longitudinal view of the structures within a lymph node, as well as some of the associated lymphatics. And from this diagram, I wanted to highlight that lymph enters on the convex side of the node through afferent lymphatic vessels. Then it travels through it and leaves on the concave side at the hilum through efferent lymphatic vessels. And the clinical relevance, of course, has to do with lymph node swelling when they are filled with white blood cells in an infection. And this is what your doctor will probably test when they feel your neck, for an example. Interestingly, lack of pain when touched in an inflamed lymphatic gland can be an indication of a cancer. However, this is not quite as clear-cut, so do not start to panic and feel yourself. There is more to it. So that's our lymph nodes, and what I want us to do next is that we should look at various lymphatic organs. And we will talk about each one briefly. And if you want more detail, you can refer back to the textbook. So let's start with the spleen. It is a blood-rich organ located in the left side of the abdominal cavity, just below stomach. In terms of the size, it's about fist-sized. This makes it actually the largest lymphoid organ in the body. And as I said, it receives a lot of blood that goes through it. Let's have a look about this. So the spleen is served by the splenic artery and vein, which enter and exit it at the hilum. And now we should have a look at some of the functions that are associated with the spleen. It is a site of lymphocyte proliferation and immune surveillance and response. Also, spleen cleanses blood of aged blood cells and platelets, with macrophages removing the dirty. And here we see some further functions. You will see that spleen stores breakdown products of red blood cells for later use. A good example of this would be iron. In addition, spleen stores blood platelets and monocytes for the release into the blood whenever they may be needed. And the final one that I wanted to mention is the role of spleen in production of red blood cells in the fetus. So, now that we have gone through a general description of the spleen's location and appearance as well as some of its functions, let's dive a little deeper. On histological level, spleen consists of two compartments, white and red pulp. White pulp is the site where immune function occurs. It contains mainly lymphocytes on reticular fibers. Red pulp instead is the site where all blood cells and blood-borne pathogens are destroyed. It is rich in red blood cells and macrophages that engulf them. One example of clinical relevance that comes to my mind results from the fact that the spleen has a very thin capsule around it. As a result, a direct blow or a severe infection can cause it to rupture. And if that was to happen, we perform something called splenectomy, which means surgical removal of the ruptured spleen. It is, though, less commonly performed these days, as we have found out that the spleen has a remarkable ability to repair itself. As an example, in children younger than 12 years, spleens regenerate even from a very, very small part, and it will not be necessary to perform this operation. If, however, spleen must be removed, liver and bone marrow can take over most of its functions. So there is a backup system in place. Let's have a look at tonsils. These are the simplest lymphoid organ. There are many tonsils which form a ring of lymphatic tissue around the pharynx. And in appearance, you could describe them as something that looks like swellings of mucosa. Tonsils are named according to their location. We have palatine tonsil at the posterior end of the oral cavity. This is the largest and most commonly infected one. We also have lingual tonsil, which is a lumpy collection of follicles at the base of a tongue. Pharyngeal tonsil instead is located at the posterior wall of the nasopharynx. And finally, tubal tonsils. These surround the openings of the auditory tubes into the pharynx. So tonsils' function is to gather and remove pathogen in food and air. I think that many of us have seen this clinical condition. Tonsillitis. So tonsillitis is an inflammation of the two oval-shaped pads of tissue at the back of the throat. And it is usually caused by a viral infection, but may also result from bacterial infection. Some typical symptoms include repeatedly sore throats, difficulty with swallowing, and sensitive lymph nodes. Some of us may have had to turn into tonsillectomy, where the tonsils get removed if an individual has a tendency of having constant tonsillitis. This is becoming less common though. This is because we are finding that lymphatic tissue and tonsils are more important than we thought before. I do want to mention that tonsillectomy is less problematic and easier and quicker to heal from in younger patients. I went through tonsillectomy as an adult, and boy, it was quite an experience. So I would not encourage this unless you really need it. Next, let's talk a little bit about a structure called Peyer's patches. Interestingly enough, they are named after Johann Conrad Peyer, who was a Swiss anatomist. These are clusters of lymphoid follicles located in the wall of the distal portion of the small intestine. Their structure is similar to that of the tonsils, which we just looked at. And finally, I want to mention about their function. They destroy bacteria, preventing them from reaching the intestinal wall. Also, they generate memory lymphocytes. Now, I want to talk a few words about the appendix. It is an offshoot from the first part of the large intestines, known as cecum. And in terms of the structure of it, as it as well contains a large number of lymphoid follicles. Its functions are just like those what we saw earlier, destroying bacteria, preventing them from reaching intestinal wall, and generating memory lymphocytes. And I keep finding that there are all sorts of interesting things available online, even a soft toy of an appendix. I imagine that this might be useful when talking to a child about appendix if she or he has to get it removed. And on that note, here is an amazing cartoon by the awkward Yeti. What I want to say with that is that we do not fully know the role of appendix, but the current theory is that it is an evolutionary remain from when we ate much more plant-based material, and this was where the bacteria that break down these were stored. And as we have moved more and more away from this kind of diet, it has shrunk in size, but still stays there as an evolutionary remainder from the past. Another thing to notice is that the appendix can of course get inflamed. And I am sure that we all have heard about someone that we know who has had this happening as an issue. And in this case, it may be that we need to remove someone's appendix surgically. Let's look at thymus. This is an interesting one, in my view, as an anatomist. It is made of two lobes, so it is called bilobed organ. And it is located in the inferior neck, extending into the mediastinum and partially overlying the heart. The main function of thymus is the maturation of T cells. What makes it interesting for us anatomists is that it is most active and largest in size during your childhood, but then slowly gets smaller and gets replaced by connective tissue and fat. It is still producing immunocompetent cells during this time, but just more slowly. So when I dissect an adult, I rarely get to see a striking thymus as I would when working on a child. So that's it for this part. I hope that you found that these videos were useful as you reviewed the lecture material for the lymphatic system. And as the next part of this chapter, we will look at the immune system. Just a heads up, it is pretty much a functional system, so there is less anatomy, and therefore some students sometimes find it a little harder to get a hold of. But I am here to try to help you to do so regardless, so I'll see you there.